We hear the term linear thrown around a lot these days in conversations about color grading. I talk about it all the time here on my channel. You'll hear other people talk about it. And yet, for being such a seemingly simple term, there seems to be a lot of confusion that arises around it. I think the main reason for this is that when you say linear or when I say linear, we may not even be talking about the same thing. So in this video, I want to walk you through 3 distinct meanings of the word linear that might be the meaning being used in the context of post-production motion imaging. Once you understand these different meanings and you're able to pick out which one is likely being used in a particular conversation or context, you're going to have a more simple understanding of what's being discussed and what needs to be done, and ultimately be more empowered to grade better images and have better conversations about the color grading process. So let's dive right in. And for this first meaning of the term linear, I actually want to move off of the color page completely, and we're going to go over here to the edit page. And here in the edit page, I want to envision a scenario where I want to animate a change over time. I want to do some keyframing of my image, okay? And in this case, let's say that I want to take the opacity of my image from 100% down to 0%, somewhere here in the back end of the clip. One way to go about this would be to go up in here to my inspector and click this little diamond icon to set a keyframe, okay? Once I've done that, I'll get the option to preview my keyframing, my change over time, directly here in the timeline. And I'm now going to scrub my playhead to the last frame of this clip, and I'm going to click this diamond once again to drop another keyframe. And here I'm going to set my opacity to 0. And you can see I've now got a change that's taking place over time to the opacity parameter of this image. Now, I start off with this because if you come from a motion graphics background or from an animation background or an editing background, as I do, it's likely that the very first time you heard the term linear used, it was to describe this type of change that we see happening to our image over time. It's a way of describing a particular style of keyframing. Its counterpoint would be what's often called an eased form of keyframing, where we would actually say, hey, I don't want to linearly descend from 100 down to 0. I actually want to have kind of a mellow start where I don't drop quite so quickly. And then toward the end, I want to slow down as I approach my endpoint. This has application in all kinds of areas of post-production motion imaging, but this is a counterpoint to linear keyframing. This is eased keyframing, okay? And again, I emphasize this not because it has a ton of relevance to our application in color grading, but because if you're coming from one of those disciplines that I mentioned, this may indeed be the very first thing that you think of when I use the term linear. And if so, it's often going to lead to confusion. So that's the first very common meaning of the word linear, although it is not terribly common or relevant in the context of color grading. I'm not going to say it's totally irrelevant, but it is less relevant than the next 2 meanings that we're about to discuss back in the color page where I'm a lot more comfortable. So let's go ahead and reset everything that we've been doing here. And I'm going to go back over here to the color page and let's talk about these next 2 distinct meanings of the term linear. To do this, we're going to go to this grayscale ramp that I've prepared here. And you can see right now I have a linear ramp. This is just a hard straight line that represents the journey from pure black up to pure white, okay? Now, the next meaning that can often be the one that's being used in the context of color grading is to refer to a linear operator. I want to give you an example of a linear operator. Gain is a linear operator. Let me give you a few more. Lift is a linear operator. Offset is a linear operator. And you can see what I mean, hopefully, when I say these things are linear operators. They are making no change in the curvature of this line. It was a straight line before, it's a straight line after. We're just changing its slope or its position in the graph, but we're not actually introducing bend or curvature into the image. That's what we mean when we refer to gain or to lift or to offset as linear adjustments, okay? A contrast to that, a counterpoint to that, would be something like gamma. You can see gamma is actually introducing bend into this image. Another great contrast to that, not surprisingly, would be my custom curves. I can do any number of decidedly non-linear things to my image when I apply changes in my custom curves, okay? So that would be the meaning, and here in our curves and looking at that gamma example, a couple of counterpoints to the idea of a linear operator. A linear operator introduces no curve or bend in the signal. A nonlinear operator does introduce some sort of curvature or bending in the signal. That's meaning number two. That's a very common way that I will invoke the term linear, even here on my channel. It's not the most common. We're going to get to that next, but it is a common one that I'll bring up, and I'll say gain is a linear operator. When I say gain is a linear operator, I hope now you understand a little bit more what I mean when I say that. I now want to talk about the third meaning of the term linear. This may be the most applicable. This is probably the meaning that I am most often invoking when I use the term linear here on my channel, and it can be slippery because it kind of relates to what we were just talking about, but it is distinct. The third meaning of the word linear is to refer to the space that we are grading within. So it's not to refer to what we are doing in the space. That would be our second example. That would be our linear operator, something like gain. This third meaning is to refer to the space that we are operating within, okay? Now, to get a better understanding of that, let's refer once again to this ramp that we have graphed here in our waveform. And let's imagine that this represents a linear relationship between scene values. So everything has a linear relationship to one another, like so, okay? This represents, again, that journey from pure black to pure white as was shown to the camera, okay? So everything has a linear relationship. What's interesting is in color grading, that's usually not the domain or the context that we are grading our images in. We are often grading our images in color grading, especially if you hang out here on the channel, inside of a log curve. And to get a sense for what that means, let's drop this lin to log conversion here onto my ramp. You can see this is itself introducing curvature to the original scene state values, right? We're compressing things down into a different curve shape than we had before. And this third meaning essentially means we are doing stuff in a domain like this, where we are still in linear, versus a more common domain like this, where we are in log. So when I say to you, I am working in linear, I don't mean that I'm applying a linear operator. I certainly don't mean that I am applying linear keyframing of any sort. What I mean is that I am applying my adjustments here in my scene or camera linear state of things, as opposed to here in my log state of things. You see the distinction there? They overlap, but they are separate ideas. Linear operators versus the linear domain that we might choose to operate in. Now, this again kind of changes with your context. If you work in visual effects, for example, you're very accustomed to working in linear. That's where much of the visual effects process actually takes place. In color grading, we tend to work in log. However, if you've been hanging out here on the channel, you might know that there are a number of operations that I actually think are highly advantageous and preferable to perform in a linear domain. That's why I say this is actually the most common meaning of the term linear when I use it here on the channel. It's to say, hey, just for the sake of this operation, this adjustment that I'm going to make, I'm going to move out of my stock or my default log domain, my log working space, and into a linear working space because there is some advantage to doing so, okay? So that's that third meaning, and I hope that now that we've rounded up all three of these, you can see how they're easily confused with one another, but hopefully that it's pretty easy to inventory these three meanings and to assess which one are we likely talking about right now. If I'm talking about an adjustment, we're probably talking about that second meaning, a linear operator. If I'm talking about grading in linear, I'm probably talking about this third meaning of grading in that particular domain. And the one to watch out for, especially when we're talking about color grading, is to make sure we're not confused and the person we're speaking with is not confused about some sort of linear or nonlinear change over time, as in the context of eased keyframes or non-eased keyframes. Once you have these three meanings straight in your mind, I think you're going to find it a lot easier to have concise and meaningful conversations that involve the use of the word linear.